Hello and welcome again to cafephotography.co.uk. Today we'll be comparing two of the most important, popular and expensive of Canon's professional lenses, the 24-70mm f2.8 USML and the newly updated version of the same lens, the 24-70mm f2.8 USML Mark II. For a long time, the Canon 24-70 f2.8 has been the bread and butter lens of professional photographers who might be shooting weddings, sports, indoor events, or doing press photography. The lens's bright f2.8 aperture lets in quite a lot of light in order to get snappy shutter speeds for sharp pictures, and this wide maximum aperture also means that you can get quite an out-of-focus background, so the lens also lends itself well to portrait photography. The zoom range of 24-70mm is not amazingly long, but it covers most of the needs of general photography. This original version of the lens has always had a stellar reputation for being built incredibly well and for offering excellent picture quality, but it's also a slightly old design nowadays, and it's now been superseded by the new Mark II version of the lens, which we're also looking at today. Let's consider how much of an improvement the newer lens is over the old. In terms of build quality, the main difference between the lenses is in size and weight. The newer lens is a little shorter than the Mark I version, and it weighs about 150 grams less than its older brother. They're both sizable, heavy lenses, but the new version is just a little bit more manageable. The newer lens has an 82mm filter thread, whereas the older is only 77, so any filters you buy will be a little more expensive. A rather interesting difference is that the Mark I lens actually extends as you zoom out to 24mm, which is in reverse to virtually every other zoom lens on the market. This feels slightly strange in use, but the advantage is that the lens can work with a much deeper lens hood. The lens hood on a newer lens is much smaller, and while that means it can fit into your camera bag more easily, it's also much less efficient. The zoom and focus rings on both lenses are very smooth, although our copy of the Mark II lens seemed to have a slightly stiff zoom ring. The copy of our Mark I lens was smoother, but it's also been used a lot more, so perhaps our new Mark II lens just needs a little wearing in. Both lenses can focus very quickly and quietly, although not as silently as Canon's new STM lenses. It seems that the newer lens is very slightly faster than the older one, but in fairness, the older lens can focus slightly closer than the newer one, so it has more range to cover. There's nothing particularly in it. Both lenses focus very accurately indeed. It's also worth bearing in mind that neither lens has image stabilization, despite their high asking prices. Now let's take some time to look at image quality. We'll start by looking at images from a full-frame camera, in this case the 20-megapixel Canon 6D. We've turned on peripheral illumination and chromatic aberration correction for the purposes of these tests. We'll start at 24mm with the aperture wide open at f2.8. Both lenses are good, but the Mark II lens clearly has an edge in sharpness levels and contrast. If we look in the corners of the image, the difference is more pronounced. The older version of the lens struggles a little, while the Mark II gives very impressive sharpness levels. When stopped down to f4, both lenses are even sharper, but the edge remains with the newer lens, and even in the middle of the image, both lenses are sharp, but the Mark II's contrast is much more punchy. Well, let's zoom the lenses in to 35mm. At f2.8, again, both lenses are nice and sharp in the middle of the image, but the new Mark II lens is even sharper than the old one. However, the corners present us with a bit of a surprise. The sharpness levels are actually a little better in the corners of the older lens. It's the same situation when you stop the lenses down to f4. However, when we look back into the middle of the image, the Mark II version of the lens pulls back into the lead, with slightly better sharpness and contrast. So at 35mm, the older lens is giving evenly good picture quality across the whole frame, whereas the new lens is excellent in the middle of the image, but slightly weak in the corners. Finally, zooming all the way into 70mm, we see a similar situation. In the middle of the image we see plenty of sharpness from both lenses, but the newer lens definitely carries the edge, showing up more detail. This time, both lenses perform about as well as each other in the corners of the image, both of them being just a little softer. Stop down to f4 and both lenses improve just a little in the corners, but once again, in the middle of the image, the new lens still has a little bit of an edge over the old. So we can say that both lenses are nice and sharp and suitable for professional work of all degrees. However, the new Mark II lens is clearly sharper in the middle of your images, with much better contrast than the older lens. It's a significant difference that many professional photographers will wish to take advantage of. Now, not many people will be using these lenses on an APS-C camera, as most people buying them will be able to afford Canon's expensive full-frame cameras. But we also decided to quickly test them both on our smaller sensor APS-C camera, Canon's new 20 megapixel 70D. Again, peripheral illumination and chromatic aberration correction were both turned on for this test. At 24mm and with the aperture wide open at f2.8, we are seeing exactly what we saw on a full-frame camera. The newer lens shows considerably more sharpness and contrast in the middle of the image, and the corners are also a little sharper with the newer lens. Stopped down to f4, both lenses are slightly sharper in the corners, but the new lens still carries its advantage, and even when you look in the middle of the image, this advantage remains. At 35mm, again, it's the same situation as we saw on full frame. With the aperture wide open at f2.8, the middle of the image in the new lens is much sharper and clearer, but surprisingly, the older lens has a slight advantage in the corners of the image. When they're stopped down to f4, it's the same situation in the corners, although again, the new lens remains sharper in the middle of the image. Interesting. If we zoom into 70mm, then we can see that at f2.8, the older lens is actually slightly soft in the middle of the image, whereas the new lens is decently sharp. The lenses are more comparable in the corners, although the new lens remains slightly sharper than the old. At f4, both lenses are slightly sharper in the corners, but the middle of the image is still owned by the Mark II lens. Overall, the Mark II lens is a far greater performer on APS-C cameras, leaving the older 24-70 lens quite far behind. So let's look at distortion and vignetting. They're only really an issue on full-frame cameras, so let's see how they both perform. Both lenses have a remarkably similar characteristic. They have moderate barrel distortion at 24mm, as you can see in the slightly curved lines in this picture. They also have about the same darkness in the corners when your aperture is wide open. Stop both lenses down to f4 and the corners brighten up a lot, although you can also use peripheral illumination on your camera to get the same effect. Zoomed into 35mm, both lenses straighten out a lot, and at 70mm we see moderate pincushion distortion, which is often noticeable in your pictures. The new Mark II lens seems to cope with vignetting very slightly better, with very slightly brighter corners. But it's an equally average performance from both lenses. As you can see in these pictures, the older L lens can focus in a little closer than the newer lens does. But if you look closely, you can see that the new lens is actually much sharper at those close distances. Even when you stop the lenses down to f4, the newer lens retains a lot more sharpness, and it's only at f5.6 that both lenses are comparably sharp. It's nice that the older lens can get a bit closer to your subject, but sharpness is always vital, so most people doing close-up work will probably prefer the Mark II lens. When it comes to working against bright lights, this footage shows that both lenses manage to keep their contrast levels reasonably high, but you also get some lens flaring. The lens flares on the older lens are quite wide and take up a lot of the frame. The newer Mark II lens seems to have a tighter flare pattern, which could be seen as a slight improvement, but neither lens is really performing successfully, probably as a result of their large glass elements. Both lenses' common maximum aperture of f2.8 mean you can get some nice out-of-focus backgrounds in your pictures, and both lenses give very good quality bokeh in your backgrounds. This characteristic is largely down to personal opinion, But the quality of the bokeh on the Mark II lens seems to be just a little softer than the Mark I, which has just a touch of outlining in some areas. But they're both good enough performers in this regard, with no major flaws. So what can we say overall? These lenses are a joy to use, but Canon's Mark II version of the lens, while being similar in many respects to its older brother, is simply a much sharper lens, which also brings much better contrast levels to the table. It's also a little smaller and lighter than the Mark I lens. The only disadvantage of the newer lens is its prohibitively high cost. It's a very, very expensive piece of kit, especially for one which lacks image stabilization. Undoubtedly, the older lens still has a lot of fight left in it, especially if you're using a full-frame camera, and nowadays it would certainly represent better value for money than its replacement. But the extra resolving power of the new lens is seriously impressive, and could make a big difference for crucial pictures. Professional photographers should get their credit cards ready for a serious hit.